Okay, welcome to note set number 39, where we're going to talk about using a discrete time system to simulate a continuous time system. And this is a really important idea that's growing in importance, I would say, at least in certain areas. And it also ties in some of the convolution ideas that we've seen. So, sometimes you're just asked to design and build a discrete time system just for some specific purpose. You're told, make a discrete time system that does this, and there's an explicit reason that you want that. But other times, you may be trying to design or analyze a continuous time system, and you want to be able to use a computer to help you assess the quality of that design. Is it behaving the way that you want it to behave? What do the outputs look like, and so forth? And so in that case, if you've got a designed continuous time system, maybe a circuit or something like that, you'd want to figure out how to simulate that inside your computer. And so that's sort of like what PSpice does in essence. So we're essentially trying to do something like that, perhaps. But you may also be familiar with, if you're a guitar player or something like that, like I am, you probably have seen companies like Line 6 and Digitech. They have hardware and software boxes that will allow you to simulate or emulate classic tube guitar amplifiers. So basically what they're doing there is taking a continuous time system and not just simulating it to see how it works, but actually to replace it by something that's a pretty close approximation. Now, if you're trying to simulate a tube guitar amplifier, there is going to be some non-linearities in there, so we wouldn't be able to do linear time invariance system analysis. But if you learn how to do this for an LTI system, that's the first step to learning how to do it for including non-linearities as well. So there are a variety of different ways to do this, but there's also some pitfalls. I've actually seen some textbooks that describe a method to do this that are just completely inappropriate and unworkable, not based upon solid theory. So it's important to understand what you're doing and make sure that what you're doing is correct. So the two methods that we're talking about here are well-founded, but there are some gotchas, so you kind of need to understand them. They're not universally applicable. So we're going to start thinking about this from the convolution point of view, and then the second method will be more of a frequency domain or transform domain approach. So, we've seen that a continuous time circuit involves the convolution that uses an integral in theory, and we've seen that a discrete time convolution involves a sum. And so it's not surprising, given that you learned in Calc 1 how you get to an integral is by starting with summations and then taking a limit. So at some point, if you make these rectangles narrow enough, you don't have to necessarily go all the way to the limit to actually get an integral. You can stop somewhat short of that and have some very narrow rectangles and have a very accurate approximation to your integral. And this is something that's actually called numerical integration. And we don't have to limit ourselves to rectangles. There are methods that allow us to define trapezoids. So, if we were to describe a trapezoid, there we can see that we get a much better approximation to this, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, obviously, this delta here is going to be the sampling rate that's involved in our circuit, as we'll see in just a little bit. Actually, in our discrete time simulation of the circuit, and the smaller that sampling interval is, the more accurate this method will be. But the important thing here is to see that to evaluate this integral, or even the one that involves the trapezoids, All we really need to know are samples of this of the signal that we're trying to work with. So let's apply this idea to convolution. Here's an integral that defines convolution, and it's pretty clear that we can approximate that with a sum over tau. So here I'm still showing t being equal to something that varies over a continuum. Now we'd want the output, we would only need to know it at a certain set of closely spaced samples, because the output's going to be the output of a discrete time system. And as long as those samples are closely spaced, we know that we can run them through a DAC and get a continuous time signal out of them. So what we're going to do is replace this t by the values spaced by our sampling interval, just like we did here and here. So capital T is our sampling interval, and now we see that we can replace this by a discrete time version of that impulse response, just simply taking the samples of the impulse response, and we get this multiplication by t. You can think of that as accounting for this differential. And since we're letting t get very small, it kind of essentially does play the role of that. So what this tells us is that we can approximately compute samples of the output of this continuous time system by taking and defining a new impulse response, t times samples of the continuous time system's impulse response, and do a discrete time convolution with samples of our input signal. So that's the key. And that's what we're saying here, and t is our sample spacing. So 1 over t is going to be the sample frequency or sample rate that we use. So we define this new discrete time equivalent impulse response by just taking samples of the continuous time system's impulse response and multiplying by capital T. And this idea has a name. It's called the impulse invariance method. We're trying to make the impulse of the discrete time system in some sense invariant of what it was for the continuous time system. So the choice of this t value, or equivalently the choice of our sampling rate, requires a little bit of attention. So not only do we need to choose t to make sure that our signal is sampled without aliasing, we also have to make sure that our impulse response is sampled without any significant aliasing, and that can be a problem sometimes. Now it's usually okay if the system is some sort of low pass filter or maybe even a band pass filter, then all we really need to do is just look at the rate driven by what's appropriate for our signal. But we really should look at what is the upper edge of the pass band of this continuous time system and make sure that that upper edge of the pass band lies significantly below fs over 2. So what that means is that there has to be an upper edge of the pass band. So a high pass filter has no upper edge on its pass band for continuous time high pass filter. So this method is totally unsuitable for implementing a high pass filter or anything that looks like a high pass filter that has no upper bound on its pass band. We'll see another method that does allow us to handle high pass filters, and we'll be talking about that method in just a little bit. So how do we use this discrete time h of n? Well, in principle, continuous time systems are more than likely to have infinitely long impulse responses. So we're going to have to truncate this thing to some sort of finite length. But what we want to do is make sure that we capture its significant part. So we'd want to look at this, kind of see what it looks like on a plot, make sure we capture enough of it. And as in most engineering things, how do we know what is significant and what isn't significant? Well, sometimes you just have to kind of play around with it and see. And if you made it this long and you get some results, and you make it a little bit longer and the results look pretty much the same, then maybe you found that you already have the most significant parts. Now, another thing that we often might try to do is apply some sort of windowing taper at the end. Usually not at the front, right? So, like a RC circuit might have an impulse response that looks like this. So, and it decays exponentially. So we might truncate here and then taper this down with a window, but we would never want to taper that down. Although I am about to tell you a little trick that we'll want to use. So the trick is, it's not quite a taper, but it's and I forget where I learned this trick, but I'd like to give credit where credit's due. It's not my idea, but it's been shown that if you replace h of 0, instead of being the actual sample, just at that one point, you replace it by half. That's for h of t that are discontinuous, I should say, at t equal to 0. Then you'll actually get a better simulation of it. So then once you have your h values here, so you've truncated them, you've maybe applied a window, you've applied this trick, you have all these h values, you're now going to implement it as an FIR filter and put that finite duration impulse response in there. Our denominator coefficients are just a single one, and we evaluate it over a range of discrete time frequencies that correspond to the continuous time frequencies that we're interested in seeing. So that's how we would check the frequency response. We'd then look at that and say, does this look like what I think my continuous time system is doing? And then if we wanted to implement it, at least in MATLAB, we could use the command filter. But again, we're implementing it as an FIR filter. So that's the basic idea of what we're trying to do here. So as already said, the drawback to this is can't handle high pass type pass bands, and it can also result in a filter that is computationally complex. Like I said, continuous time systems tend to have impulse responses that decay down, and it may decay down fairly slowly, which would mean that when we truncate, we have to keep quite a bit of it, and so that would lead to a very long H, which means a very high order FIR filter, and therefore potentially computationally complex. So, so that's method number one. Method number two works in the frequency domain. So instead of trying to match the impulse response, we try to match the frequency response of the continuous time system. And it turns out that this method works very well even for high pass types. And even for non-high pass systems, we have to worry about how this frequency response spreads out over the whole minus infinity to infinity range. And so there might be some significant aliasing involved with this previous method that we just talked about. So here's what we're going to do. I'm not going to derive all the math. There's a fair amount of heavy-duty math involved in this, so you're going to have to just trust me to some degree. But what we're going to try to do is squish, that's a technical term, right? We're going to squish the whole minus infinity to infinity frequency range into the minus fs over 2 to fs over 2 range, and then we can implement that with a discrete time system very simply. So the idea is that what we'd like to be able to do is take something that looks like this. So here's our continuous time frequency response versus f, and what we're going to try to do is take all of this stuff and squish it down into 0 to fs over 2. So these little blue lines here are showing that we don't squish by the same amount. So down in this region, we're hardly doing any squishing at all. We're taking the frequencies directly. So this value goes almost exactly to its same value as does that, and so then we start seeing a little bit of an angle here. So that means that we're taking that frequency and moving it a little bit to a lower frequency, but not a lot. But then as we get outside of the significant region where this filter is passing stuff, now we're starting to really move things down a lot. And in fact, when we get out to infinity, we're essentially mapping infinity to exactly fs over 2. So that's what we would desire. And then this dashed thing that I'm showing here, what that's showing is that what we've done is we've made room for all the spectral replicas. Remember, we're going to be doing this in a discrete time frequency representation, or discrete time frequency response. So it's going to have all these replicas because it's a DTFT. So we've smashed this whole thing down into this region, and then it gets replicated in the higher frequency regions. And all we're really doing is we're still showing this on a Hertz axis, but we can convert that effectively from our actual minus pi to pi using this equation. So remember, fs over 2 corresponds to pi. And so without deriving it, some clever people a long time ago have discovered this thing called the bilinear transform that does exactly this. And basically what the bilinear mapping says is that we take our continuous time transfer function h of s, and we take all the s's that are in there and we replace them by this. And so now suddenly we get something that is a discrete time transfer function as a function of z. And the nice thing about this is that not only does it do this squishing that I showed on the previous chart, but if we started with a rational h of s, which we would get from a differential equation that we've been looking at, it takes it into a rational h of z, which is what we need for the types of systems that we've been talking about in this class. So that's really nice. So what it does is it takes a rational h of s from a differential equation and converts it into an equivalent, approximately equivalent IIR discrete time system. And that really is beautiful. So once we've applied this bilinear transform, so we take our h of s, we plug this in, we get an h of z. It'll be a rational function. We look for the numerator and denominator, we pick off the coefficients, we put them into freq z, and we run our freq z to find out what h looks like, and we verify, does it match what we are hoping to get? And then we would implement, this is supposed to say IIR. Copy and paste is a real pain in the butt sometimes. Because we have both B and A here, we're going to have an IIR filter. So let's look at an example of this. I drew this circuit from a book called Electronics for Guitarists, Springer, 2011. Now this is not necessarily the best simple single tone control in a guitar amp, but this is one that was analyzed in this book as a very simple example of thinking about how a tone control, single knob tone control might work in an amplifier. So it goes between two different preamp stages, and so we have to account for the output resistance of the previous stage and the input resistance of the subsequent stage. And basically it's just this series RC, and the resistor is adjustable, so as you turn the knob on the front of the amp, all you're doing is adjusting this resistor. And when you have the knob fully counterclockwise, then this is all the way up to the top, and you're bypassing the resistor. So fully counterclockwise is 0 ohms for the resistance, and then as you turn it clockwise, you're bringing this wiper down farther, and then you're getting whatever resistance is up at the top. So as you turn it clockwise, you get more resistance. And it's important when implementing this that you would use a so-called audio taper potentiometer, which this is just a illustration. They're not all exactly like this, but this is an illustration of going from 0 degrees to maximum 240 degrees of shaft turn. It doesn't linearly change the resistance. It only changes, if alpha were a multiplicative factor times r, it changes it nonlinear like this. In fact, it's a logarithmic relationship. So what we're going to do is, assuming that we have an audio taper pot like that, we'll replace this resistance by alpha times r, recognizing that as we turn this thing clockwise, alpha goes from 0 to 1. And we're just going to ignore for the most part, ignore the fact that it's an audio taper pot, although we do keep track of that in some of the analysis here. So we've got our circuit. We replace by the Laplace impedances, S-domain impedances, and we combine this series combination into a single impedance there. Then we do a parallel combination of those two things to get an equivalent impedance there. Now things are starting to look a little nasty here, but it's not too bad. You just chug along cautiously and carefully, and you get your results. So I've just redrawn that there. And so now we need to do a voltage divider. So it's a little bit hairy here, but not too bad. And now it's just a bunch of algebra. So we recognize that we've got this term here, so we multiply top and bottom by that. And so now it's just a matter of algebra, and I'm not going to insult your intelligence by stepping you through step by step. I mean, this is like 10th grade stuff. It's tedious and it's error prone, but there's no rocket science here, really. So eventually we get this down into a form that looks like this, and you can see that I was constantly chugging forward to try to get it into something that had just S terms. I ended up pulling out a constant out in front to just make things easier. But what I see is I've got 1 0 and I've got 1 pole. Now I also notice that as I change alpha, I'm changing where the 0 is, and I'm also changing where the pole is. So two things are happening. But one thing I can see is that depending on how big RO is, that may dampen how much effect the alpha has on where the pole is. But these are my breakpoints. Now picking up a Bodie flavor to thinking about this. So those are where the breakpoints are. And now I can think about what happens as I change things. And so clearly, as I change alpha, the 0 location changes a lot. And I also can figure out from this that the pole is lower than the 0. So I start flat, since there's no single S up in the numerator. I start flat. I hit the pole first, so it breaks and goes down. Then I hit the 0 and it levels out. And so then what ends up happening as I change alpha, the pole does change some, but the 0 really changes. And what happens is that as alpha increases, the breakpoint for the 0 increases. So the 0 moves out this way. So here it drops off just a little bit and then levels off. As I decrease alpha, the 0's moved out, so it drops off a lot longer and then shelves at a lot lower range. So you can see that between the two of these, the one on the right is going to suppress high frequencies a lot more than the one on the left. And that's the action of this tone control. Now, when I set alpha equal to 0, so that's when I turn the pot all the way so that alpha is equal to 0, where does this pole, or where does the 0 go? Alpha goes to 0. This breakpoint goes to infinity. If I look at this up here, this term goes away, and so now I have no 0. My breakpoint from a 0 has in fact gone to infinity. And in reality, this shouldn't even be there. And so this never levels off. It never levels off. It just continues to decline. And so that's the most attenuation for the high frequency components. So noticing that we've got things that behave like this tells us that we would not be able to simulate this circuit using the impulse invariance method. We'll have to use the bilinear transform to simulate this thing. So if we do a nice freak-S plot of this, we can see for different values of alpha what happens. So when alpha is equal to 1, and in that case, we hardly have any degradation of the high frequencies at all, maybe a tiny little bit. And then as alpha increases, we get this shelf moving lower and lower, and then finally alpha is equal to 0. There's no shelf at all. This just keeps going forever. And so in these vectors down here, I'm just showing you where the breakpoints are for these different values of alpha. And these are the components that I used. I took those out of that textbook, that Electronics for Guitarists book. And you can see that, yes, the pole does actually move up as well, but not nearly as much as the 0 moves. So this gives you an idea of how this thing is going to behave. And just zooming in on this region up here, so for alpha equal to 1, you see that there is a little bit of a drop off, but it's it's only a couple dB. And also remember that this is at 100, right? And for a guitar, your low E string is around not quite at 60 hertz, but it's pretty close. So here's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. So most of your guitar stuff is above that, and so you don't see this acting on your signal at all. So it is flat. It's just that you're losing some signal. But hey, you got tubes in there to make up for that, so that's fine. So if you want to see the code for how I made these plots, it's on the next slide. Now, because the frequency response stays flat for alpha greater than 0, we can't use the method where we implement the sampling of the impulse response. So we have to use the bilinear transform method. And then these are the component values. And this is the transfer function that we're trying to simulate. And this code is just implementing the the simulation design. So all of this stuff up here is just computing the true frequency response. So I use log space to generate some frequencies, and then I just explicitly evaluate this H. I could have used freak-S to do that if I wanted. I chose not to do that. And then I plot the results. Plotted them on log frequency axis. Now I'm going to design the equivalent discrete time filter. So we'll assume that this is going to operate at like a standard audio sampling rate, 44,100 hertz. Here's the command bilinear that MATLAB has. It's a nice simple command to use to design the equivalent discrete time system, and I just populate it with the coefficients necessary drawn from my known H of S. Up here I can set alpha to be what I want, and then I have to tell the bilinear design routine what sampling rate I'm using. And now I'm going to use lin space, and generate points between 0 and pi, and then use freq z to compute the equivalent bilinear design frequency response. And then I'm going to plot it, but I want to plot it on against the equivalent continuous time frequencies. So WD ranges from 0 to pi. Then I divide by 2 pi and multiply by fs. That converts the point pi into fs over 2, which is our standard equivalence. Fs over 2 maps to pi. And then I plot it on a semi-log axis with decibels. And so this the plot on the next curve, or on the next chart here, shows for the same alpha values we looked at before, the blue curves underneath are the curves, the true frequency response, and then the red dash curves are for the bilinear design. And you can see that works really well for these high, kind of, this isn't quite high pass, it is low, it's a treble cut filter, but it's what's known as a shelving filter. So in a sense this is like a high pass filter, and you see that the bilinear transform works really well for that. If you were to zoom in down here, you'd see a little bit of error, and I'll leave you to run the code and check that out. The place where we see the most error is on alpha equal to 0, and there we can see that all of these frequencies out here are getting mapped into points really close to fs over 2, so that causes this line to bend down like this. Now the point is that here's fs over 2, that's as high as we're going to go, as high as our discrete time approximation covers, and so really in this region we're not getting an awful lot of discrepancy, and it's above what we would typically be able to hear anyway. So in the significant region of 15K and below, it's pretty accurately simulating this. Now if we wanted to do this even more accurately, we could run our simulation at a higher sampling rate. We would need our signals to be sampled at a higher sampling rate. And there's a lot of tricks that you can play when you learn some of the more advanced DSP stuff to be able to do that kind of stuff. But this illustrates quite nicely that this type of design works really well. And if you want to play around with this and hear what this thing sounds like, I've got this MATLAB code that I'll post on my webpage. And you can download it and try it out, and I've even got a guitar wave file there that you can listen to. So that ends this video lecture. Thanks, and see you in the next one.